Jeffrey Dahmer was born in 1960 in a quiet suburb of Milwaukee, a child whose early years appeared unremarkable on the surface. Neighbors recalled a shy boy who kept to himself, a boy who sometimes stared into empty spaces as if seeing something no one else could. Even then, whispers of odd behavior circulated in hushed tones among the few who dared to wonder. Yet no one could have foreseen the monstrous path that lay ahead. As Jeffrey grew older, the seeds of isolation and confusion deepened. In high school, he was an outsider, awkward, withdrawn, and burdened by an inner world he could not share. He frequented local hangouts alone, sometimes lingering outside a movie theater long after the crowds had dispersed. On one such evening, as neon lights flickered and shadows merged with the city's restless night, Jeffrey's mind wandered to the notion of control, of power over life and death. That thought would eventually coalesce into a dark compulsion. By the mid-1980s, Jeffrey took up residence in a nondescript apartment complex in Milwaukee. The building, unremarkable in its faded bricks and sagging stoops, housed a diverse mix of residents, young professionals, elderly retirees, and those adrift in the margins of society. To the casual observer, nothing about Dahmer's apartment appeared unusual. Yet behind its closed door, a secret life was unfolding. Inside the apartment, the atmosphere was both sterile and suffocating, a place where the ordinary trappings of a modest home were overlaid with signs of a disturbed obsession. The living room was sparsely furnished. A worn sofa, a small television set that flickered static late at night, and shelves lined with various trinkets that upon closer inspection hinted at the macabre. There were photographs of smiling strangers, a scrapbook of clippings that chronicled local news, and notebooks filled with disjointed sketches and notes that only Dahmer could understand. Jeffrey's routine was marked by meticulous precision. Every morning, he rose at the same time, a habit born from years of self-imposed isolation. He would brew a single cup of coffee in a battered percolator, sit at a small table by the window, and stare out at the early light as if searching for meaning in the mundane. In those moments, the world outside seemed both inviting and hostile, a delicate balance of hope and despair that mirrored the tumult in his own mind. Milwaukee's nights offered Dahmer a kind of twisted solace. The city's pulse slowed after dark, and the streets became an open stage for the desperate and the lonely. It was on these streets that he began to encounter those who, like him, were adrift, lost souls with no safe harbor. In the dim glow of streetlights, beneath the hum of passing cars, he found his potential victims, young men who wandered alone, vulnerable and unprotected. One such night, in the humid heat of an August evening, Jeffrey observed a young man leaning against a bus stop. His name was Marcus, a nickname whispered among the local community, a young man with bright eyes and a hopeful smile that belied the hardships of life on the margins. Marcus was a dreamer, often seen jotting down poetry in a worn notebook, his thoughts a refuge from the crushing weight of reality. On that fateful evening, as Marcus waited for a bus to take him home from a late shift at a downtown diner, Dahmer's gaze locked onto him. In that moment, a silent calculation began, a predatory focus that would soon engulf both lives in tragedy. For Dahmer, the act was not solely about the thrill of control. It was also an escape from the haunting loneliness that had defined his existence. In his mind, Every interaction was a chance to assert his dominance, to forge a connection, even if it was a twisted, perverse one. Marcus, whose life was already marked by struggle, unknowingly stepped into the shadow of a fate he could never have imagined. Before the darkness that night, Marcus had led a life that, while marked by hardship, was filled with moments of quiet beauty. His mornings began with the soft clatter of the city awakening, coffee shops coming to life, newspaper vendors calling out the day's headlines, and the faint sound of church bells ringing in the distance. He would walk through neighborhoods lined with tall trees and red brick homes, the same path he had followed every day for years. In these simple routines, Marcus found a semblance of stability, a rhythm that, for him, was both a comfort and a reminder of the world's indifference. At work, Marcus was known for his gentle nature. The diner where he worked was a small establishment with red vinyl booths and a counter that had seen better days. There, he served plates of hearty food to regulars who treated him with quiet respect. In the back of his mind, however, the weight of his own dreams, writings of hope, verses of pain, and stories of survival, bubbled up in moments of solitude. He scribbled in his notebook whenever he could, trying to capture fleeting fragments of beauty amidst the grayness of everyday struggle. Back in Dahmer's apartment, the juxtaposition of these two lives was stark. While Marcus carried hope in his heart and a notebook filled with dreams, Dahmer's inner world was consumed by darkness and a compulsion to claim the lives of those who dared to wander. Their fates were poised to collide in the labyrinthine streets of Milwaukee, a collision that would mark the beginning of a series of events that would terrify the city for years to come. That August night, as Marcus waited for the bus, Dahmer approached him with an air of cautious charm. He spoke in soft, measured tones, words that carried the weight of both loneliness and a disturbing intensity. Marcus, tired from a long shift and eager for some company, found himself drawn into the conversation. Dahmer's questions were probing, yet seemingly benign. Where was he headed? Did he have a family? What dreams did he carry in that battered notebook? The conversation, like a carefully laid trap, led Marcus deeper into Dahmer's orbit. With each passing minute, the young man's initial wariness softened into a semblance of trust. Dahmer suggested they walk together for a while, claiming that the bus was late. Under the watchful eyes of silent streetlights, the pair wandered the back alleys of Milwaukee, where the neon signs of closed bars flickered in and out of focus. Unbeknownst to Marcus, with every step he took, he was stepping closer to a fate from which there would be no return. Dahmer's mind, a tangled web of desire, fear, and a desperate need for control, calculated the perfect moment, a moment when the vulnerability of his newfound acquaintance would allow him to execute his twisted plan. As the hours crept by, Dahmer led Marcus to a nondescript building on the outskirts of the city, a place that, like Dahmer's apartment, blended into the urban landscape with unremarkable anonymity. Inside, the atmosphere was dim and oppressive. The flicker of a single light bulb cast long shadows on bare walls, and the heavy scent of stale air and regret mingled in the silence. In the quiet of that room, the world outside seemed to vanish. Dahmer's intentions, dark and inevitable, took hold. The confrontation was brutal and unremitting, a clash between the hope that Marcus carried and the twisted compulsion that had long festered within Dahmer. In the ensuing struggle, Marcus's life was irrevocably shattered. The pain, the terror, and the final moments of clarity for the young man became another dark chapter in a saga that would haunt the streets of Milwaukee for years to come. For Dahmer, the act was followed by a chilling calm, a return to the quiet routine that had defined his existence. In the sterile aftermath, he meticulously cleaned the space, attempting to erase every trace of his cruelty. The apartment, which had once been a sanctuary for his hidden desires, became a canvas upon which he attempted to repaint the horrors of his actions in a facade of normalcy. The tragedy of Marcus was only the beginning. In the months that followed, Dahmer's nocturnal hunts continued, a grim cycle of predation that claimed more lives and left the city shrouded in an ever-growing pall of fear. Each victim brought with them a brief glimpse of life, a story of hardship, of dreams unfulfilled, of silent battles fought on the margins. Some were lured with promises of companionship or a warm meal on a cold night. Others were picked up from the streets as if they were discarded memories of a life that had no place in the bright light of day. Among these victims was Darren, a young man with an infectious smile who worked at a local record store. Darren had a gentle soul and a passion for music, spending evenings at small gigs in dive bars and dreaming of one day playing in a band. His routine was filled with the simple pleasures of life: long walks by the lake, afternoons spent reading at the park, and conversation that made him believe in the goodness of people. But in Dahmer's world, even the brightest light was destined to be snuffed out. There was also Thomas, a college student studying art in hopes of capturing the world's beauty on canvas. Thomas's days were filled with classes, sketches in crowded cafes, and moments of introspection as he strolled through the bustling stress of downtown Milwaukee. His passion for life was palpable, yet he carried a quiet loneliness, a sense of being adrift in a city that often seemed indifferent to his dreams. In Dahmer's cold, calculating presence, Thomas found himself unwittingly drawn into a web of horror that would silence his creative spirit forever. For Jeffrey Dahmer, each encounter was more than an act of violence. It was an affirmation of a perverse desire to control, to possess, and to transform the lives of those who had crossed his path. His apartment became both a sanctuary and a tomb, a place where the mundane routines of life were juxtaposed with unspeakable acts of cruelty. Every day, he maintained a veneer of normality. He went to local bars, struck up conversations with acquaintances, and even smiled politely at neighbors, all while the darkness inside him grew with each passing moment. In his meticulously kept journal, Dahmer wrote entries that were clinical in detail, notes on his daily routines, observation of the city's rhythm, and cryptic reflections on his inner turmoil. To an outsider, these entries might have appeared as the ramblings of a disturbed mind. In truth, they were the inner workings of a man who had long since lost the ability to distinguish between the ordinary and the monstrous. Over time, the disappearances in Milwaukee began to mount. Rumors circulated, murmurs of young men vanishing after a night out, whispers of sightings in dark alleys and near abandoned buildings. Law enforcement, initially dismissive of the scattered reports, slowly found themselves confronted with the undeniable evidence of a serial predator on the loose. Investigators scoured neighborhoods, re-interviewing friends and acquaintances of the missing, piecing together the puzzle of lives interrupted too soon. Families mourned in private, their grief compounded by the silence of an indifferent city. Darren's mother recalled how her son had always been full of hope, his laughter lighting up their small home on the outskirts of Milwaukee. Thomas's art professor lamented the loss of a promising student, a talent that had once held the promise of beauty and creativity. And yet, in the hidden depths of Milwaukee's underbelly, Dahmer continued his grim work, meticulously planning his next move, always one step ahead of those who sought to expose him. By the early 1990s, the weight of the mounting disappearances could no longer be ignored. The investigation had grown more focused, with detectives following leads that spanned the city and beyond. A breakthrough came when a would-be victim managed to escape, a frantic encounter in a darkened apartment corridor where fear and desperation collided in a moment of raw humanity. That survivor's testimony, though fragmented by shock and pain, provided the authorities with the critical details needed to connect the dots. For Jeffrey Dahmer, the days of unchallenged predation were numbered. The escape, though painful for the victim, was a crack in the carefully constructed facade that had allowed him to operate in the shadows for so long. As law enforcement closed in, Dahmer's meticulously maintained routine began to unravel. The apartment that had once been his private chamber of horrors now buzzed with the presence of detectives and forensic experts, each one seeking to uncover the truth behind the bloodstains and cryptic notes. It was a bitter winter morning when the authorities finally breached the door of Dahmer's apartment. The scene that greeted them was one of disarray and lingering decay, a macabre gallery of evidence that chronicled years of unspeakable acts. In the dim light, detectives found notebooks filled with sketches and calculations, remnants of bottles and tools, and photographs that captured moments of twisted intimacy. The room, once a sanctuary for Dahmer's dark desires, now stood exposed to the harsh glare of justice. In the days that followed, the full extent of Dahmer's crimes became public. The city was plunged into shock and horror as the stories of lost lives and shattered futures were recounted in detail. Families who had once held on to hope now faced the grim reality that the predator among them had stalked the streets for years, claiming lives in a calculated spree of cruelty. As the investigation unfolded, efforts were made to honor the lives that had been taken too soon. Memorials were held for victims like Marcus, Darren, and Thomas, each person remembered not for the manner of their death, but for the promise they had carried with them. In community centers and local churches, survivors and loved ones gathered to share memories, to lament the potential that had been stolen, and to vow that their stories would not be forgotten. For many in Milwaukee, the aftermath of Dahmer's crimes was a journey through grief, anger, and ultimately, the slow process of healing. The city, scarred by the revelation of such unspeakable horror, embarked on a path toward reconciliation, seeking to understand how ordinary lives could be entwined with such profound darkness. As Jeffrey Dahmer's trial unfolded in stark, clinical detail, the public was forced to confront the depths of depravity that had festered in their midst. The courtroom became a stage upon which the narratives of both victim and perpetrator clashed, a somber reminder of the fragile boundary between normalcy and monstrosity. Expert testimonies, reams of evidence, and the anguished accounts of survivors painted a portrait of a man whose inner world had spiraled beyond redemption. In the months following his conviction, Dahmer's demeanor remained eerily calm, a detached acceptance of the consequences that now bound him. Behind the cold, unyielding bars of a maximum security prison, he would spend his final days reflecting on a life that had been consumed by darkness. The man who once roamed the streets of Milwaukee, blending into the fabric of the city, had become a symbol of a horror that was as real as it was unfathomable. For the families of the victims and for a community that had been forever altered by his actions, the trial was both a moment of reckoning and a painful reminder of the past. The lingering questions of how such evil could take root, of the signs that might have been missed, and of the quiet, unassuming moments that preceded the horror, continued to haunt the collective memory of Milwaukee.